At 24 to 5, well, there's a lot going on in federal politics. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has kick-started his election campaign and the race is on. Let's bring in someone who helped drive Tony Abbott to victory at the polls. She knows a thing or two about election campaigns, his former Chief of Staff and current Sky News host Peter Credlin, and she joins me live on the line with her analysis as she does each and every Wednesday. G'day, Peter.
Great to be with you, Jim.
As always, let's call this what it is, Peter. Scott Morrison's election campaign is definitely underway.
Oh, no doubt about that. I mean, he's desperately trying to get it off pandemic discussions. And to be fair, discussions about the pandemic and vaccinations, all of that stuff has fallen away in the last couple of weeks. So post-Glasgow, he's now got to make everything he can out of the economy. We know by about March, we'll see the December quarter number, Christmas shopping, etc., wash through. Everyone's predicting there's sort of pent-up demand. People are going to be out there spending, travelling, etc. You would expect those numbers to be good. The budget's due in May. There's talk it's being brought forward to April. So he's only got 4 or 5 months to turn things around. He's had bad polls for nearly 12 months now. So I think this is where he will try very hard to reset going into Christmas and then come out of the gate come Australia Day and away we go.
Do you think he's on the back foot right now?
I'd never say Morrison's on the back foot. I mean, I think he's one of the best political campaigners. I mean, his profession is politics. He was a professional state director, a campaigner before he went into a seat himself, and I think he's very, very canny about the mood. I think he's had own goals. I think he's had problems with language. You know, it's not a race. I don't hold the hose. I think he's got to be careful that this sound and appearance of arrogance doesn't creep in. I think that's a real death knell for him. But he is very strategic, and I think he's got a good sense of where Middle Australia is.
You were the Chief of Staff to Tony Abbott when he dominated the 2013 election. You know the ins and outs of campaigning better than anyone. If you were Scott Morrison's Chief of Staff right now, what would be the 2 or 3 big things you'd be focusing on?
I think he's got to get back to household level. I think there's a sense that, you know, particularly with Glasgow and all these targets, they seem a long way away. He's talking about submarines in 2050. He's talking about net zero 2050. People in the pandemic, we've all become quite fixated on a very small footprint. You know, our own suburbs, our home. We've been homeschooling our kids. Some have been worried about their jobs. We've really been confined to our suburbs. So we've got, I think, a very internal or immediate family sense of where we want the country to be and how we perhaps concerned about our kids catching up at school and my business now kicking back into gear, particularly if it's a small business that you own. And I think that's where he needs to take it. There's too much globalism, I think, at the moment and too many targets off in the never, never. And I think he's got to actually have a fight with Labor. And this idea that everything he does, he'll only do if it's bipartisan. Well, scrapping a carbon tax for Abbott when he won in a landslide, well, that wasn't bipartisan. Stopping the boats, that certainly wasn't bipartisan. If you don't give your supporters something to fight for, it's hard to motivate them. And it's hard to get them out spruiking for you. And this, I think, where the coalition, not just Morrison, but the coalition, has to put some energy back in its in amongst its people. A lot of people in the coalition that I talk to are a bit disappointed with net zero 2050. They see it as a backflip. They're a bit disappointed even with electric cars because he was against this in 2019, really took short and on about the issue of electric cars. And now here he is spruiking yesterday and today almost an identical policy. So I think people want to see him pick up issues like culture and the curriculum and, as I said, domestic issues, maybe tax cuts, red tape for small business, stuff that really matters.
Well, he's visited Melbourne for the first time in 6 months. He's on a 4-day tour of Victoria. Do you think he's down there to win seats or to hold seats?
Probably the reality is hold, but I think Victoria's a tough constituency for him. I think Victorians, even those who have supported him in the past, feel that he perhaps apologised too much for Daniel Andrews during the pandemic. I think there were occasions when he could have called out where Labor were, and it's just a litany of errors that happened in Victoria that didn't happen in any other state. But he tended to sort of back in Andrews over Victorians, and I think that's in part why the Prime Minister has a pretty low rating in Victoria. Now, it's weird. The same thing happens in New South Wales. Even where the New South Wales government was the one that had instituted lockdowns, it's the Prime Minister who's suffering in the polls in New South Wales and not Berejiklian and not Dom Perrottet. So I do think he has potential seats to win in New South Wales. I think there's opportunity there. I don't think there's much opportunity in Victoria. There's a new seat coming in, but it's nominal Labor seat as it stands. And the other marginals, he's got a retirement in Tony Smith and the seat of Casey. So I think that if he came out maybe with a one-seat loss or coming out even, he'd see that as a great win.
How about Queensland and WA? I mean, you probably won't get into WA for campaigning, but how do you see that unfolding in the next few months?
WA be by design that he can't get in there. I mean, McGowan's pretty canny, and McGowan then will be the trusted voice about the federal game. I mean, if Morrison can't get in there, Albanese can't either, but that's actually a win for Labor. I keep Albanese away from the voters, and that's a positive. So I think the interesting thing will be the wipeout of the Liberal opposition in WA at a state level. How much will that retail federally? Will it hamper their ability to drive messages on the ground? How much infrastructure has been annihilated, campaigning infrastructure? I think that'll weigh heavily on the minds of the federal Liberals. And in South Australia, it's a one-seat loss potentially. Boothby, there's a retirement there. And Queensland, I would have said Queensland would be a stronghold for the PM, but I think the net zero issue has played out poorly for him in those coal seats in northern Queensland. I think that's one of the reasons why Hunter is not in play for Liberals either. So it'll be a case of trying to hold. He's got some retirement there too. I don't think it'll be as positive as it was perhaps in the past, but I can't see that Labor's made much ground there either. So Queensland and New South Wales are where I think the interest will be come the federal campaign.
I'm speaking with Sky News host Peter Credlin. Peter, I want to ask you about AUKUS and the nuclear submarines. US Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos has ruled out buying nuclear submarines built mainly in the US or the UK, saying he wants them built in South Australia. Now, I'm right behind using Australian manufacturing to build things like trams, trains and ferries. It's a red-hot issue in this city and state right now. But with something like these nuclear submarines that are so key to our national security and so complicated, should the priority be getting these boats in the water quick, smart, rather than making Aussie jobs the priority?
Couldn't agree more, Jim. We're going to get the best boats we can, the world's best boats. If we were just interested in boats that could be built here, we would have stuck with a French deal. Think of all the technology we have. We're not demanding iPhones are built in Australia. We all just want the best phone. Cars now, we have, unfortunately, I think for Australian manufacturing, import all our cars, and we all want the best car we can afford. In the case of submarines, in the case of the timeframes, I think the timeframes are a long way off. We need tighter timeframes. We need subs in the water sooner rather than later. But I think there are plenty of other things like sustainment we perhaps can do in Australia. That's maintaining them. Obviously, all the crews will be based in Australia. There is other ships we can build. There are other boats that we do build in Australia. There's plenty of technology that we do here in a defence sense. But I think something as complex and as a nuclear submarine, we are best to go with proven technology, given the safety issues as well. Proven technology because that's safer and faster. And that's our priority. And
the last thing we need is a capability gap between the Collins class and these new subs. That's the bottom line.
Well, we've got one. We've got one.
That's true.
And we've got to do what we can to minimise it. And I think that's where we just got to give up this idea that they're in South Australia. And quite frankly, this pork barrelling exercise about defence procurement just always being focused on South Australia. The rest of the country has a stake in this. And I think our national security needs trump South Australians needing jobs paid for by federal taxpayers. And if there's concern in South Australia about not having this contract, then they should fill that gap, as I said, with ships and other things, or the South Australian government can get out there and build an economy rather than just rely on defence contracts out of Canberra. I mean, I think we as a country have to do what's right by the country, not just what's right by South Australian job seekers.
Peter, always great to get your analysis. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Great to be with you, Jim.
That's Peter Credlin, Sky News host and political insider.